There was no moon over the southern Red Sea at 1:12 a.m. The water was black and flat, the kind of flat that only happens when the atmosphere above it is pressing down with unusual weight, and the stars above the horizon were sharp and dense in the way they get over open ocean far from any coastline. The USS Georgia was running at periscope depth, 17 meters below the surface, her hull cutting through the water at a speed that produced almost no detectable wake. She had been in this corridor for 9 days. Her position had never appeared on any fleet tracking system accessible below the top compartment of the operational chain. Her crew knew what they were doing and where they were doing it. They did not discuss either. The intelligence that had sent her here had taken 4 months to assemble. It had come from 3 separate collection streams, each operating independently, none of them aware of the others until an analyst at a facility whose name does not appear in unclassified directories had noticed a pattern in the data that only became visible when all 3 streams were laid on top of each other simultaneously. The pattern described a vessel, not a warship. A registered commercial freighter operating under a flag of convenience out of a minor port authority that had long since stopped performing meaningful inspections of the cargo it certified. The vessel had made 7 transits through the Gulf of Oman in the preceding 18 months, each time departing from a pier in Bandar Abbas that satellite imagery had, on 3 separate occasions, shown to be active with loading operations conducted exclusively at night. On those 3 occasions, the pier's overhead lighting had been switched off during the loading window. Cranes had moved under infrared observation only. The cargo manifests filed with the Port Authority described machine parts, agricultural equipment, and construction materials. The cargo that those manifests described weighed, according to the filed documentation, significantly less than the vessel's observed draft on departure. Something heavy was going aboard in the dark. Something heavy enough that the ship rode lower in the water than its paperwork suggested it should. The draft differential had been calculated independently by 2 analysts who had never spoken to each other, working from imagery collected 6 weeks apart. Both had arrived at the same number, and that number, when run through a density estimation model calibrated to the known physical parameters of the cargo categories the manifest described, produced a residual mass that corresponded to no legitimate agricultural or construction load. It corresponded to something else entirely. And on the 7th transit, a signal's intercept had caught a single encrypted burst transmission from the vessel's communications suite. A transmission that had been routed through a relay architecture previously associated exclusively with the IRGC Quds Force Logistics Network. The transmission had lasted 11 seconds. Its content had never been fully decrypted, but its origin, its routing path, and its timing relative to the vessel's departure from Bandar Abbas had been enough. Enough for a decision to be made at a level where decisions of that kind get made. Enough for the USS Georgia to be given a set of coordinates, a timeline, and an authorization package that her commanding officer had read once, acknowledged, and locked in the safe beside his bunk. The vessel's name was irrelevant. What was relevant was its current position, 41 nautical miles northeast of the Georgia's present location, transiting southwest at 11 knots on a heading that would bring it into the central Red Sea shipping lane within 6 hours. Its destination, according to its filed transit notification, was the port of Hudaydah on the western coast of Yemen. Hudaydah had been the entry point for Iranian-origin weapon systems into the Houthi supply network for years. The port infrastructure had been partially degraded by previous interdiction efforts, but the network had adapted. It always adapted. And this shipment, according to the intelligence assessment that accompanied the authorization package, was not a routine resupply run. The assessment described what it believed was aboard in careful, precise language: medium-range ballistic missile components, guidance system modules, re-entry vehicle structures. Not assembled weapons. Components. Enough components, if they reached their destination and were transferred to the technical teams waiting for them, to provide a significant enhancement to the adversarial force's ability to conduct precision strikes against naval assets operating in the Red Sea corridor and against port infrastructure in Allied territory to the north. The assessment had used the phrase "strategically consequential" twice in 3 paragraphs. That phrase did not appear in assessments unless the people writing them believed it. At 1:47 a.m., the Georgia's executive officer completed his second review of the intercept package that had been updated 6 hours earlier by a P-8 Poseidon Maritime patrol aircraft operating at altitude far enough away from the vessel to avoid any possibility of detection. The P-8 had confirmed the vessel's position, heading, and speed. It had also confirmed something that the original intelligence package had not anticipated. The vessel was not traveling alone. Running without lights at a distance of approximately 4 nautical miles off the freighter's port quarter was a second hull. Smaller. Faster. A profile consistent with an Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft, the kind of vessel specifically designed to escort sensitive cargo transits through contested maritime corridors and to complicate any interdiction attempt with the threat of immediate kinetic response. The Escort had not been in the mission planning. It had not been in any of the collection that had preceded the mission. It had appeared from somewhere, attached itself to the freighter's transit, and was now running dark and fast in a position that placed it between the freighter's port side and the most likely approach vector for any surface interdiction attempt. Whoever was managing this shipment had either anticipated the possibility of interdiction or had adopted the practice of armed escorts as a routine precaution. Either conclusion produced the same tactical problem. The freighter could not be approached directly without the escort presenting an immediate threat to any interdicting asset, and engaging the escort openly would transform what was supposed to be a zero-attribution operation into an international incident with the IRGC's fingerprints on every available surface. The commanding officer studied the updated plot for 90 seconds. He did not ask for opinions. He already knew what the options were because he had spent the last 9 days on station thinking through every variant of what this moment might look like. He had slept in 4-hour intervals for 9 nights, always with the same thought waiting for him when he woke. What does the mission look like if the escort is there? He had worked through 8 versions of that answer. He knew which version he would choose and why. He picked up the secure handset and transmitted a single coded update to the fleet coordination node operating from an asset he would never meet in person. The response came back in 4 minutes. 2 words. The authorization stood. At 2:09 a.m., the Georgia's launch team completed their targeting solution. The weapon they were preparing to employ was not a torpedo and not a cruise missile in the conventional sense. It was a specialized variant of a system designed specifically for the interdiction of surface vessels in scenarios where the employment of conventional munitions would produce unacceptable collateral signature. The system's warhead was configured to disable propulsion and navigation infrastructure without producing the kind of catastrophic structural damage that would result in rapid sinking. The objective was not destruction. The objective was incapacitation and seizure. A vessel on the bottom of the Red Sea with its cargo scattered across 40 meters of seabed helped no one. A vessel adrift in the water, its crew alive, its cargo intact and accessible, was an entirely different kind of outcome. The escort was the problem. The escort was always going to be the problem. At 2:17 a.m., the electronic warfare officer completed a 30-second active sweep with a system that operated in a frequency range the IRGC Fast Attack Craft's Electronic Support Measures Suite was not optimized to detect. The sweep confirmed the escort's exact position, speed, and heading. It also confirmed that the escort's surface search radar was active and scanning in a 270-degree arc covering the freighter's approach sectors. The only geometric blind spot was directly behind the escort's stern, in a narrow wedge approximately 15 degrees wide. That wedge was the only approach geometry that did not place the Georgia's weapon launch within the escort's radar coverage. The problem with the stern wedge approach was bathymetric. The seafloor topography in that sector featured a shallow ridge that compressed the available depth envelope to a margin that made the required approach geometry very close to the edge of what the Georgia's navigation team would consider acceptable risk. Very close to the edge was not the same as over the edge. The navigator said so, quietly and precisely after running the calculation twice. The commanding officer nodded once. At 2:31 a.m., the Georgia adjusted her depth and came to the new heading. The crew moved through their stations with the particular focused quiet of people who have trained so long for a specific sequence of actions that performing those actions has become, if not routine, then at least free of the kind of hesitation that costs time. The smell in the control room was recycled air, electronics, and the faint chemical note of the CO2 scrubbing system running at its standard operational rate. The overhead lighting in the control room had been shifted to red, reducing the operator's visual adjustment time if they needed to move through the vessel rapidly. Nobody was moving rapidly. Everyone was precisely where they needed to be, doing precisely what needed to be done. The shallow ridge passed 11 meters below the keel. The navigator exhaled through his nose. At 2:44 a.m., the Georgia was in position. The weapon solution was locked. The escort was 3.2 nautical miles off the Georgia's starboard bow, its radar still scanning, its crew unaware that something had just moved into a geometry from which they could not be observed. The freighter was 7.1 nautical miles ahead on the same bearing. The firing sequence would be executed in 2 stages, separated by a precise interval calculated to ensure that the weapon reached the freighter's propulsion section at the exact moment the escort's radar was in the furthest point of its sweep away from the freighter's position. The interval was 47 seconds. The weapons officer initiated the first stage at 2:44 a.m. and 18 seconds. The weapon ran straight and silent at depth, tracking the acoustic signature of the freighter's propulsion plant, adjusting its terminal approach geometry automatically as it entered the final phase of its run. The freighter's crew had no warning. There was no warning to have. The weapon did not emit. It did not ping. It did not announce itself in any detectable way. It simply ran and arrived and did what it had been designed to do. The impact was felt rather than heard aboard the Georgia. A low, structured vibration propagated through the water column and reached the submarine's hull as a dull pressure wave approximately 4 seconds after the detonation. The sonar operator reported the acoustic signature of the freighter's main drive shaft coming to an uncontrolled stop. Secondary reports followed: cavitation collapse, consistent with propeller separation, mechanical noise consistent with flooding in a localized aft compartment, and then the specific acoustic signature of a vessel losing way and beginning to drift. For 11 seconds, nothing else happened. Then, the escort's radar changed its sweep pattern. The interval between sweeps compressed sharply, the electronic signature of a crew that had just detected something unexpected and was now searching with urgency. the fast attack craft's engine acoustic increased. It was turning, accelerating, moving toward the freighter. This was the moment the mission planning had identified as the point of maximum exposure. The Escort was now alert and moving. It would reach the drifting freighter in approximately 9 minutes. When it did, it would find a vessel with catastrophic propulsion damage and no visible cause. The Escort commander would have to make a decision. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine whether the cargo could be secured and transferred, or whether the entire shipment went to the bottom of the Red Sea with a Houthi supply network none the wiser about what had happened to it. But the Escort commander made a decision that the mission planners had assessed as a secondary possibility and hoped would not materialize. Rather than immediately moving to the freighter's assistance, he ordered his vessel to hold at a distance of approximately 1 nautical mile and began broadcasting on a military frequency. An emergency signal, encrypted, tight beam directional, aimed back toward the Iranian coast. He was calling for support, and he was doing it before his own asset had been affected, which meant he suspected something was in the water. The electronic warfare officer was tracking the transmission in real time. He had the frequency, the direction, and the approximate power level. He did not have the content, but he did not need the content. The behavior was the content. Somewhere in the Iranian military communication network, an emergency call from an IRGC naval asset in the Red Sea was arriving. The response time would depend on what assets were positioned to respond and how quickly a decision chain could be activated at that hour of the morning. The intelligence estimate, based on known IRGC naval posture in the region, suggested a response window of between 40 and 90 minutes. The Georgia had approximately 35 minutes before that window created an operational environment that would make any further action significantly more complicated. The boarding element had been at readiness since 2 a.m. 8 operators from a naval special warfare unit that had been pre-positioned on a vessel operating under commercial cover approximately 60 nautical miles to the southwest. They had been transferred to an inflatable hull craft in darkness 2 hours earlier, and had been waiting on the surface, engines idling, for the launch authorization that came through their encrypted communications suite at 2:51 a.m. The craft ran without lights at maximum speed on a GPS track that brought it to the drifting freighter's position from the sector directly opposite the Escort's holding position. 31 minutes transit time. The Escort held its position. It continued transmitting. Its crew was watching the freighter, watching the water around the freighter, watching the radar picture for anything that did not belong. They saw nothing approaching from their side of the freighter. The boarding craft was already in the geometric shadow of the freighter's hull when the Escort's radar completed its nearest sweep. The operators were aboard the freighter at 3:24 a.m. The deck was wet from the light spray that had been building since midnight, and the footing was uncertain on the painted steel surface. The point man moved to the bridge access ladder and began his ascent without pausing. The rest of the element fanned across the main deck in the pattern they had rehearsed in a warehouse 14 weeks earlier, using a full-scale mock-up of a vessel of this class constructed from plywood and painted steel pipe. They had run the sequence 47 times in that warehouse. They had run it in daylight, in darkness, with simulated resistance without. They had run it timed, and then run it again when they were behind time, and learned the difference between pace that was fast enough and pace that created errors. Tonight, there were no errors. Every door was where the mock-up said it would be. Every corridor dimension was what the technical drawings had described. The layout of a vessel of this class was not a variable. It was a constant. and the operators moved through it the way water moves through a known channel. What happened on that deck in the next 18 minutes was a sequence of actions executed with the kind of speed and precision that is only possible when the people performing those actions have rehearsed them to the point where conscious thought is no longer the primary driver of the process. The crew of the freighter, 17 personnel, were consolidated in the forward crew compartment without incident. The cargo hold was accessed through the main deck hatch. What was inside matched the intelligence assessment in scope and exceeded it in one specific detail that the boarding team's cargo specialist documented with a compact imaging system before touching anything else. He transmitted the documentation package to the overhead relay at 3:29 a.m. The relay forwarded it to the analysis node. The analysis node confirmed. The authorization for the final phase of the operation was transmitted back at 3:34 a.m. The demolition specialist had been preparing his package since boarding. The charges were placed at 6 specific points in the cargo hold, configured not for structural destruction of the vessel, but for the complete and irreversible rendering inoperable of every component in the shipment. The guidance modules would be inert. The re-entry structures would be unrecoverable. The technical data embedded in the system's programming interfaces would be overwritten by a dedicated device left running in the hold for the 11 minutes between placement and the team's extraction. Whatever technical knowledge those components represented, whatever capability they would have transferred to the forces waiting for them at Hodeidah, would not survive the next 12 minutes in a usable form. At 3:41 a.m., the demolition specialist activated the sequence and the team began extraction. They were off the freighter's hull at 3:43 a.m. The boarding craft ran southwest at maximum speed. Lights still off, hull low on the water. At 3:47 a.m., the charges initiated in a sequence that produced a contained detonation series audible to the escort at 1 nautical mile as a muffled internal concussion with no external fire and no secondary explosion. The freighter did not sink. It drifted, damaged and dark, its cargo rendered permanently inoperable, its crew alive and unharmed in the forward compartment, its distress beacon now active and transmitting on the International Maritime Emergency frequency. The escort moved to the freighter at 3:49 a.m. Its crew would find exactly what was in the hold. They would know what had happened. They would have no evidence of who had done it. The Georgia had already turned southwest and was running deep. Her reactor had a power setting that produced no detectable acoustic signature at the distances that mattered. The boarding craft rendezvoused with its parent vessel at 4:22 a.m. The operators transferred across in darkness, and the craft was stowed below decks before first light. The parent vessel resumed its logged commercial transit heading. At 6:15 a.m., an IRGC Naval Response asset reached the freighter's position and found a vessel with catastrophic internal damage to its cargo hold, a crew that had been confined but was physically unharmed, and a hold full of components that would never function as intended. The emergency transmission the escort had sent had been received and acted upon. The response had arrived in time to find the aftermath, not in time to find the cause. The Red Sea moved on. The shipping lanes filled again with the ordinary commerce of the world. Somewhere in the southern corridor, a submarine ran quiet and deep on a heading that would take it away from everything that had just happened, and its crew stood their watches, and the log recorded nothing unusual. 41 nautical miles of operational corridor, 8 boarding operators, 18 minutes on target, 0 crew casualties, 0 recoverable intelligence left aboard. The shipment that was supposed to change the ballistic equation in the southern Red Sea arrived nowhere. A supply chain built in shadow depends on the assumption that the shadow is enough. When the operators who move through that darkness are better trained than the darkness is deep, the assumption fails, and the equation stays exactly where the men in the water decided it would stay. In the deep lanes, the unseen hand holds the line, until the mission demands otherwise.